Have you ever been in a situation where no matter what you do, uh, you're going to make someone mad,
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there, haven't we?
especially if you're in a position of authority? Having to make tough calls where there's no easy answer.
Absolutely. And today we're diving deep into the story of a man who faced that dilemma on a massive scale, Pontius Pilate.
Ah, Pontius Pilate. Most people probably know him from the Bible, right? The Roman prefect who oversaw the trial and crucifixion of Jesus.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is how much we actually know about Pilate beyond the biblical accounts.
Oh, I always kind of assumed he was just a name in a story, so there's more to him than that.
There is. He was a real Roman official operating within a complex historical context. And there's even archaeological evidence that confirms his existence and his actions.
Wow, so we're not just talking about a figure shrouded in myth and legend. We can actually piece together a more historically grounded picture of this guy.
Precisely. So before we get into the trial itself, let's set the scene. Judea in 30 CE was a region simmering with tension. It had only been under direct Roman rule for about 25 years.
So I imagine there was some pushback, right? Some resistance to this new power structure.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Pontius Pilate enters the picture. He was the prefect of Judea, a military title, which tells us a lot about his primary responsibility.
Keeping the peace, basically making sure things didn't erupt into chaos.
Exactly. Think of him as the Roman enforcer tasked with maintaining order in a region known for its, well, religious and political fervor.
That sounds like a tough job, especially with Jerusalem being such a religiously and culturally significant city for the Jewish population. Was that where Pilate was based?
Actually, no. His administrative headquarters was in Caesarea Maritima, a coastal city much more Roman in character. It boasted a grand temple dedicated to Roma and Augustus, a bustling port connecting him to the rest of the empire.
So, a bit of a power move there, keeping some distance from the potential hotbed of Jerusalem.
You could say that. Jerusalem at the time was seen as a bit of a powder keg.
And I'm guessing Pilate wasn't too keen on getting caught in the blast.
Precisely. He would venture into Jerusalem primarily for major Jewish festivals like Passover, often bringing extra troops to deter any potential uprisings.
Ironic, isn't it? Bringing in the troops to keep the peace sometimes has the opposite effect.
Absolutely. This show of force sometimes just inflamed tensions further, a real balancing act for Pilate.
So speaking of legal matters and keeping things in order, when it came to capital punishment, did Pilate have the final say in Judea, even for cases judged by Jewish courts?
Most scholars agree that, yes, Roman law superseded Jewish law in matters of capital punishment.
Meaning?
Any death sentence, even one handed down by a Jewish court, would have needed Pilate's stamp of approval.
Okay, so that little detail is definitely going to take on a whole new significance when we get to the trial of Jesus. And that brings us to probably the most well-known sources about Pilate.
Yes.
The Gospels.
Right. But we always have to remember that each gospel was written decades after the events. Each has its own theological and political perspectives.
So we can't just take them as straightforward historical accounts.
We have to be careful. They offer us glimpses into how early Christians viewed Pilate and the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion, but they're interpretations, not just neutral historical reporting.
Gotcha. So let's start unpacking these different portrayals, shall we? Beginning with the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the four.
All right. In Mark, you really see a stark contrast set up between Jesus, this peaceful preacher, and Barabbas, an insurrectionary figure. It's a classic way to emphasize certain qualities. Mark even throws in this intriguing detail of a Passover amnesty, where the crowd gets to choose who to release.
Wait, a Passover amnesty, so like a get-out-of-jail-free card. Would a Roman governor really hand over that kind of power? It sounds almost too dramatic to be true.
You're right to question that. Scholars debate whether such an amnesty truly existed or if it's more of a narrative device Mark uses to, heighten the drama, and maybe even highlight Roman injustice.
It's like he's playing on the tension between the Romans and the Jewish population.
Yeah.
And we have to remember, Mark was writing after the Jewish War, right? When things were really heated.
Exactly. So that historical context can't be ignored when analyzing these texts.
All right, so Mark sets the stage with this dramatic amnesty. But how does the Gospel of Matthew add to the story?
Well, Matthew gives us that iconic image of Pilate washing his hands, claiming innocence in Jesus' death. He literally says, "I am innocent of this man's blood."
It's such a powerful moment. It's almost theatrical,
Okay.
And I can't imagine the crowd was too happy about that.
Oh, definitely not. Their response is chilling. His blood be on us and on our children.
Wow. It's one of those lines that just sticks with you.
For sure.
Now, we can't forget about the Gospel of Luke, which throws in another twist to the whole trial.
Right. Luke adds a trial before Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. It's almost as if Luke is going to great lengths to emphasize Jesus' innocence.
So he's cleared by not one, but two high-ranking figures.
Exactly.
Interesting how each gospel writer chooses to emphasize different aspects of the story. And finally, we have the Gospel of John, which presents a slightly different Pilate, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. John's gospel is full of deep theological conversations, and his Pilate engages in these philosophical back and forths with Jesus. He even asks that famous question, what is truth?
So this Pilate seems less concerned with legal procedure and more with the deeper questions of life and meaning.
That's one way to look at it. It's a much more philosophical portrayal.
So what are we to make of these differing portrayals of Pilate in the Gospels? What's the takeaway here?
I think they offer a fascinating window into early Christian thought, how they grappled with these events, the crucifixion. But to get a more well-rounded picture of Pilate, we need to move beyond the Bible.
And explore what other historical sources have to say.
Yes.
Sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Pontius Pilate. We were just talking about how to get a more complete picture of him.
Right, we have to go beyond the Bible and look at what other historical sources say about him.
And you mentioned Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah, Philo was a Jewish philosopher. He was actually alive at the same time as Pilate, so he gives us a pretty unique perspective, a distinctly Jewish perspective, you could say. And he doesn't hold back on his opinions of Pilate.
Oh, really? Strong opinions. Lay it on me.
Well, he describes this incident involving Pilate and some shields. Pilate dedicated these shields in the Praetorium. Essentially, that was the Roman governor's official residence in Jerusalem.
Okay, shields. I'm not seeing the problem here. What's so controversial about dedicating some shields?
Well, these weren't just any shields. They were inscribed with Pilate's name and, more importantly, Tiberius's full name, including his divine titles.
Ah, so putting the emperor's name and divine titles right in the heart of Jerusalem. That was bound to ruffle some feathers.
You got it. The Jewish population saw this as a major provocation. I mean, they considered it blasphemous to have those symbols in their holy city.
Right, right. Especially with Tiberius's reputation. He wasn't exactly known for being tolerant of perceived disrespect, was he?
Definitely not. So according to Philo, some of the Herodian princes,
Remind me, who were they again?
they were local rulers
Yeah.
collaborating with Rome. Anyway, these princes went to Pilate and asked him to remove the shields, but he refused.
So they went over his head, straight to the emperor. That's a pretty bold move, going up against a Roman prefect like that.
Oh, it was. But surprisingly, Tiberius sided with the Jewish delegation. He ordered Pilate to take down the shields.
Oh, wow. So Pilate had to back down. That's not exactly the image of a strong Roman leader we often get from history.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It suggests that even a powerful Roman prefect like Pilate wasn't totally immune to pressure from above, especially when the emperor stepped in. But on the other hand, maybe it shows some political savviness on Pilate's part, knowing when to pick his battles.
Could be. So Philo gives us this incident with the shields, but he also gives a more general assessment of Pilate's character, right?
Yeah,
And if I remember correctly, it's not exactly glowing.
not at all. He throws out words like ferocious, greedy, avaricious, prone to executions without trial, savage, cruel, even merciless.
Yikes. Paints a pretty brutal picture.
Yeah.
But I mean, should we take this at face value?
Good question. We always have to think about the author's biases, right? Philo is known for his strong defense of Judaism and his tendency to, well, let's say he wasn't a fan of anyone who didn't strictly adhere to Jewish law.
So maybe some exaggeration make a point.
Possibly. But even with that in mind, Philo's account suggests that Pilate wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests among the Jewish population in Judea.
He was probably seen as the face of Roman oppression.
Probably.
Okay, so let's move on to Josephus, shall we? The Jewish historian who was writing a few decades after these events. What's his take on Pilate? Does he paint a similar picture to Philo?
He's a little more nuanced, I'd say. Josephus describes this incident where Pilate tried to bring Roman military standards into Jerusalem. You know, those banners adorned with images of the emperor.
Oh, yeah. Those were a big deal for the Romans.
Hugely symbolic. And for the Jewish population, well, they were not having it. They saw it as a total violation of their religious beliefs. Putting those standards in Jerusalem, talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. So how did Pilate handle this one? Did he double down, force his way through? like Philo might have suggested.
Actually, no. According to Josephus, Pilate eventually backed down. He removed the standards. It suggests that he was, willing to compromise when he was facing strong opposition. A little pragmatism, maybe.
That doesn't really sound like the ruthless tyrant that Philo describes.
It's funny how we get these different perspectives. I think it just goes to show historical figures are rarely one-dimensional. Even someone like Pilate, who often gets painted as a villain, probably had moments of pragmatism, maybe even some begrudging respect for the people he ruled.
Makes you wonder, what was going through his head? What were his motivations?
We can only speculate. Of course, with Josephus, we have to remember he was writing after the Jewish War, a devastating event for the Jewish people.
Ah, so he might be shaping the story to highlight Roman insensitivity, blaming them for the conflict.
It's possible. Historical accounts are always colored by the context in which they are written. Josephus gives us some valuable insights into Pilate's actions, but yeah, we have to keep that context in mind.
Okay, so that's the standards incident. But I think Josephus also mentions another event that caused a stir for Pilate, something involving a Samaritan Messiah figure.
Oh, yeah, totally. This Samaritan leader had gathered a following, and according to Josephus, they were all meeting on Mount Gerizim, a super sacred spot for the Samaritans.
And Pilate, being Pilate, wasn't too thrilled about that, was he? Always on edge about potential unrest.
Right. So he sent his troops to break it up.
And things escalated, I'm guessing. I don't remember Pilate being known for his restraint.
Yeah, you're right. Things got out of control. There was violence, bloodshed, and this time there were serious consequences for Pilate. The Samaritan leaders were outraged, and they appealed to the Roman legate in Syria. Pilate's boss, basically.
Uh-oh. So Pilate was in trouble.
Big time. He was ordered back to Rome to explain his actions.
That's a pretty dramatic turn of events. So off to Rome he goes to face the music. Is that where the story ends for Pilate?
Well, that's where the historical record gets a little fuzzy. We know he got to Rome around 37 CE, just as Tiberius died and Caligula became emperor. But after that, it's a mystery.
So we have no idea what happened to him, whether he was found guilty or, exiled or given a new posting.
Unfortunately not. History just leaves us hanging on that one.
Okay, so we have these accounts from Philo and Josephus. But what about some hard evidence? Does archaeology have anything to say about Pontius Pilate?
It does, and this is what gets me really excited. We have archaeological evidence that actually backs up Pilate's existence and his role as prefect. The most famous piece is the Pilate Stone. It's an inscription that was found in Caesarea Maritima.
Wait, are you serious? His name, like engraved in stone. That's pretty amazing.
I know, it's really incredible to think about. Archaeologists are digging around and they find this stone slab that directly connects to Pontius Pilate. Sadly, a part of the inscription is missing, including his first name.
Ugh, so close. But still, it's amazing to have that tangible link to someone we've been talking about for the past hour. It makes him seem so much more real.
Totally. And it's not the only thing. We also have coins from the time that Pilate was in charge. They have symbols of both Roman power and local agriculture, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah. So maybe he was trying to, appeal to the local population while still asserting Roman authority.
It's possible. There's also evidence of this massive road, a monumental road, they call it, in Jerusalem. It led to the Temple Mount, and they think it was built when Pilate was in charge.
So Pilate was a builder, too. I'm starting to get a sense of the man's ambition.
Right, like he wanted to leave his mark on Judea. There's also evidence for an aqueduct that he might have built, which Josephus also mentions. And then there's the Pilato ring.
The Pilato ring. That sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings.
Huh. Well, it's not that grand. It's just a simple copper ring. Probably belonged to someone who worked for Pilate, maybe an administrator or an overseer. But even these little artifacts can tell us a lot about the people who lived back then.
It's incredible how archaeology can bring history to life like that. We're not just talking about names and dates anymore, We have these physical objects that connect us to the world of Pontius Pilate. It makes you wonder what other secrets are still out there waiting to be discovered. But before we get too carried away with the thrill of archaeological discoveries, we need to talk about the big question: Pilate's legacy. It's amazing how one person's story can echo through, centuries.
It really is.
We've been talking about Pontius Pilate, and it seems like every source we look at just adds another layer of complexity to the guy.
Definitely. On the one hand, we have these accounts of him as a brutal, power-hungry Roman prefect, someone who would just crush anyone who disagreed with him.
And Philo definitely painted him in that light, didn't he? But then we also see these moments where Pilate seems more pragmatic, like he was willing to work with the Jewish population, at least sometimes.
Right. He wasn't always the tyrant he's often made out to be. That incident with the Roman standards is a good example.
It really shows how differently this same event can be interpreted depending on, well, who's telling the story.
Exactly.
But I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to Pilate's legacy,
No.
his role in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus.
Absolutely. And even there, we see a whole spectrum of interpretations.
Like what?
Well, some early Christians actually saw Pilate as sympathetic to Jesus.
Really?
Yeah. Some even thought he was a secret believer. And in some traditions, he and his wife are considered saints.
Saints. That's a far cry from the image of the ruthless Roman governor. It shows just how differently the same event can be interpreted depending on who's telling the story.
For sure. But of course, the more common view of Pilate is, well, the one who condemned Jesus, a symbol of moral weakness.
Right, the guy who washed his hands of responsibility instead of doing what he thought was right.
And that image of Pilate really became powerful in the 20th century, especially during the Stalinist era. He became this, spinelessness, moral compromise.
Like in Bulgakov's Master and Margarita.
Yes, exactly. Pilate is this tortured figure full of guilt because he didn't have the courage to stand up to the authorities and save Jesus. It's a powerful story, a cautionary tale about what happens when we stay silent in the face of injustice.
It's really interesting how different historical periods, they kind of shape our understanding of figures like Pilate. It's almost like we project our own anxieties and, well, our own moral dilemmas onto these historical figures.
You're absolutely right. We see what we want to see in them, I guess.
So after all this, what can we say about Pontius Pilate? Was he a tyrant, a pragmatist, a tragic figure, something else altogether?
I think the evidence paints a really, really complex and ambiguous picture. We see a man who is capable of both ruthlessness and compromise, grand gestures, but also brutal crackdowns. I honestly think the true motivations of Pontius Pilate are a mystery that's lost to history.
And maybe that's why he continues to fascinate us. After all these centuries, we're drawn to the unanswered questions.
I think so too. We want to understand him, but we can't. Not completely, and that just makes him more intriguing.
And his stories inspired so much art and literature and, well, even comedy. I mean, we see Pilate everywhere, from serious books to Monty Python.
Exactly, and I think that speaks to the power of history, how these events and these figures from the past, they can still resonate with us today. They make us question things, think about power and morality, and the choices we make when we're faced with, well, seemingly impossible situations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Pontius Pilate, I have one final question, and it's for you and for everyone listening. Imagine you're in Pilate's shoes, faced with that same impossible choice. What would you have done?
Oof, that's a tough one.
It really is. There's no easy answer.
Yeah?
But it's a question worth thinking about, isn't it?
For sure. And it reminds us that history is about so much more than just names and dates. It's a tapestry woven from human choices and actions and consequences, and those things continue to shape our world even today.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll subscribe and share this deep dive with your friends. Be sure to tune in next time for another exciting exploration into, well, who knows what? History, science, culture, you name it.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.